Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the December 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and in it we're continuing our reading of Lavender in Red by Leslie Feinberg, with parts 25 through 29 from 2005. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So before we continue, we just want to thank the Workers' World Party for hosting this file under a Creative Commons license at workers.org. There is a link to the file in the video description. Part 25. Post-World War II Europe. The Struggle for Decriminalization. In the Cold War following World War II, imperialist ideologues sought to make capitalist democracy synonymous with, quote, freedom, and the workers' states out to be totalitarian. In fact, both were based on the dictatorship of one economic class over another. However, the class character of the two social systems was the opposite. The capitalist state brutally upheld the social relationship of exploiter and exploited, oppressor and oppressed. East Germany, the GDR, and the Soviet Union, the USSR, while not the pinnacle of workers' democracy that is possible in a socialist society, were based on liberating the working class from the exploitation and oppression of capitalist rule. As this series has demonstrated, at the same time that the US, Britain, and West Germany were excoriating East Germany as despotic, workers there enjoyed jobs, free healthcare and education, rent that could not exceed 10% of their income, vacations, and the advances made toward lesbian and gay liberation far surpassed anything that had been wrested by struggle under capitalism. What was life like for gay men and lesbian women in other capitalist countries in Europe and in England during and after World War II? An extensive historical exhibition at the Art Academy in Berlin in the summer of 1997 provided some important historical details. The art exhibit, co-sponsored by the Schwules Museum, was entitled Goodbye to Berlin, 100 Years of Gay Liberation. A limitation of the exhibit is that it did not incorporate the role of lesbians in the century of struggle. The following information was provided in the published curator's notes. France. With the rise of German fascism, Paris supplanted Berlin as the European gay center, that is, until Nazi troops goose-stepped into Paris. Quote, the end of the Third Republic in the late 30s was accompanied by social and political struggles. The Spanish Civil War and the Popular Front in France forced homosexuals to take a stand either on the right or left. Unquote. While the southern part of France was unoccupied, the northern region, including Paris, was under the rule of German Nazi forces. The Quisling Vichy government, led by Marshal Pétain, collaborated with German fascism. Quote, one group of homosexuals took up opposition to Pétain and any form of collaboration with the Germans, joining the resistance movement. A second group, including André Gide and Girardot, waited. A third group collaborated. Once again, homosexuals were represented on both sides of oppressors and victims, collaborators and resistors. Unquote. In 1940, Pétain's regime instituted the Code Pénal, which included Statute 334, making homosexual behavior punishable by imprisonment. Quote, although most of the laws initiated by the Vichy government were rescinded when the Nazi regime was defeated, this clause was maintained under a new name, Statute 331, paragraph 3, and was enforced throughout France. Unquote. Homosexuality between consenting adults had been legal in the country since the Napoleonic Code was introduced in 1804. That code, following the French bourgeois revolution, formally removed the anti-gay vestige of feudal law. It was the first time in Europe that a criminal code omitted consensual same-sex relations. Quote, in the course of the 19th century, Holland, Italy, and several Swiss cantons adopted the revolutionary French penal code. The prosecution and persecution of, quote, pederasts continued, however, in the scope of police disciplinary powers under which alleged offenses could still be pursued, unquote. The end of German fascist occupation did not lead to gay and lesbian liberation in France. In 1960, while transgender was celebrated entertainment in the Paris Varietés performances, the repressive de Gaulle government beefed up penalties for homosexuals. Switzerland. Some gays who fled the rise of fascism in Germany emigrated to Basel and Zurich, Switzerland. Quote, there have been initiatives for organizing homosexuals in German-speaking Switzerland since 1922. After several failed attempts in Zurich and Lucerne, the Swiss Friendship Movement was founded in 1931 with the decisive participation of lesbian women in Zurich and Basel. Unquote. Together with the Damenclub Amicitia and the Eccentric Club Zurich, they published the first Swiss magazine for homosexuals. The first issue of the Friendship Banner was published in January 1932. Beginning in 1941, women took a less active role, and the group became an exclusively male organization, which called itself Liga für Menschenrechte. Quote, during World War II, when the Nazis destroyed the beginnings of a gay movement in occupied Czechoslovakia and Holland, the Zurich-based group was the only worldwide organization that could preserve the idea of homosexual emancipation. Although the legal restriction against homosexuality had been formally lifted in Switzerland in 1942, anti-homosexual campaigns continued. The leader of the Swiss homoerotic movement, Karl Mayr, known by the nom de guerre Rolf, advocated, quote, unobtrusive behavior in public. The gay group called the Reading Circle, Der Kreis, survived the war. Quote, in 1945, Zurich's Reading Circle, Der Kreis, had an unbroken 13-year history which served as a model for other countries in the immediate post-war years. The group's magazine, Le Cercle, had an international focus, unquote. After the war, the Circle held regular meetings which drew members from many countries. Quote, in order to protect themselves from police action, only subscribers to the magazine who were above 20 years old and had valid identity cards were allowed into the meetings. Members also had to vouch for any guests they had brought, unquote. Near the end of the 1950s, the meetings ended altogether after the magazine Tat, or Action, complained that the Circle was allowed to meet on state property. England. The curators note, quote, the sexual openness that existed in England during the Second World War was pushed back in the years immediately afterwards. Quote, the gay spies, Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, defected to the Soviet Union in 1951, events which became the subject of intense investigation by a press that had few limits, unquote. And the case of Lord Montague of Beaulieu, charged with having had sex with working-class youths, exploded into another media-fueled scandal. Calls to clamp down on the, quote, increasing threat of homosexuality led to the establishment of a government commission in 1954. 3 years later, the commission recommended decriminalizing homosexuality between consenting adult males. It took another decade before the law was changed. Demand for decriminalization. Quote, the need for international contacts and exchange was very strong after the experiences in the Nazi period, the curators conclude. In particular, the International Committee for Sexual Equality, or ICSE, which had been founded in Amsterdam shortly after the end of the war, made efforts to create an international network of newly formed gay movements, unquote. Interdisciplinary conferences focusing on homosexuality took place in Amsterdam in 1951, Frankfurt on the Main in 1952, Amsterdam in 1953, Paris in 1955, and Brussels in 1958. Quote, the newest research results were presented by doctors, psychologists, lawyers, sociologists, and staff from various homophile organizations in Europe and America. In addition, demands for worldwide decriminalization of consenting homosexuality were formulated, individual cases of homosexual discrimination were denounced, and new strategies in the fight for legal equality were decided upon, unquote. The Swiss Circle continued to hold influence. It played a role in creating an international connection. Editor Karl Mayr, or Rolf, maintained contacts with homophile groups in France, Germany, Scandinavia, and Holland. In addition to poetry and short stories, the Circle reported on activities of homosexual organizations around the world. Quote, it created not only a singular forum for the most recent discussions about the theme of homosexuality, but also contributed greatly to the international exchanges within homosexual movements, unquote. Beginning in the mid-1950s, the trilingual magazine even reached the shores of the United States, where a ferocious storm of anti-gay state repression was reaching hurricane proportions. Part 26. Before McCarthy, the Pentagon. Even before McCarthyism menaced gays and lesbians in the United States in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Pentagon brass had ratcheted up an anti-homosexual witch hunt in the ranks of the military that left its impact on civilian life as well. Historian Alan Berub's book, Coming Out Under Fire, The History of Gay Men and Women in World War II, makes a great contribution towards understanding this particular period of repression. World War II was a period of great exodus, voluntary and involuntary. 16 million men were conscripted into the military, leaving their farms and towns, campuses and cities behind. An estimated equal number of civilians, mostly women, left their homes to find wartime employment. Millions more moved from rural areas and smaller towns to the burgeoning port cities and industrial hubs. Women, Berub notes, quote, filled jobs in heavy industry and other defense work, widely expanding their presence in the paid labor force and increasing their ability to live independently, unquote. African American women and men migrated from the South to northern and west coast cities where jobs were available in the military industries. Behroob stressed that the uprooting of such a large segment of the population, quote, disrupted the everyday lives of a generation of young men and women, exposing them to the power of the federal government and the vast expanse of the United States, the great variety of its people, and ways of life they had not imagined. In particular, quote, the massive mobilization for World War II relaxed the social constraints of peacetime that had kept gay men and women unaware of themselves and each other, bringing out many in the process. Gathered together in military camps, they often came to terms with their sexual desires, fell in love, made friends with other gay people, and began to name and talk about who they were. Quote, when they could get away from military bases, they discovered and contributed to the rich gay nightlife, parties, bars, and nightclubs that flourished in war-boom cities, unquote. But, Behroob points out, gay and lesbian GIs caught in sexual acts, netted in methodical roundups at stateside or overseas bases, or seeking medical or religious advice about their sexuality, found themselves fighting another war. Quote, as officers began to discharge homosexuals as undesirables, the gay GIs who were their targets had to learn how to defend themselves in psychiatrists' offices, discharge hearing rooms, hospital wards, and, quote, queer stockades. There they were interrogated about their sex lives, locked up, physically abused, and subjected to systematic humiliations in front of other soldiers, unquote. Some 10,000 gays and lesbians were forced to endure this harsh repression, a fraction of their estimated total numbers in the ranks, but proof of a climate of terror. However, some brave individuals took on the military establishment. Behroob concluded, quote, those veterans who fought to upgrade their undesirable discharges for homosexuality began to define their struggle with the government as one for justice and equal rights, ideas that became a prerequisite for a political movement, unquote. Witch hunt. After World War II, with the ascendancy of McCarthyism in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the campaign to demonize homosexuality and transsexualism and to enforce Dick and Jane gender conformity became essential components of the anti-communist witch hunt. In fact, McCarthyism inseparably linked sexual and gender queerness with communism, making them virtually synonymous. Mouthpieces for reactionary titans of capital tried to define the Cold War as a battle between capitalist democratic, quote, freedom and communist, quote, totalitarianism. These spin doctors even tried to equate German fascism with workers' states in the Soviet Union and East Germany, the German Democratic Republic. Capitalist democracy is itself a form of dictatorship of the class that owns the productive apparatus over the class forced to work for wages. During the 1950s, however, even the limited democratic features of this form of state rule were seriously eroded under the weight of political reaction. While the period of political reaction in the U.S. during the 1950s was not fascism, it did not try to crush all the workers' organizations or carry out the systematic genocide of millions, the epic does carry with it this lesson. As long as the social relationship of capital rules, with exploiter against exploited, oppressor versus oppressed, hard-won social and economic gains can be quickly wiped away. In order to understand the domestic repression during the 1950s, it's necessary to look at the international relationship of forces. Global class war. The Cold War was fundamentally a class war against the socialist countries as well as oppressed peoples in this country and around the world. World War II had so weakened most of the colonial powers in Europe and Japan that oppressed peoples in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East seized the historic moment and rose up for real independence. The U.S. imperialists hoped to gain from this against their imperialist rivals, but in many countries, liberation movements led by communists defeated pro-imperialist puppet governments. The triumph of the Chinese Revolution sent the U.S. capitalist class into an enraged frenzy. The ruling class in this country was also deeply worried about the developing relationship between China, the Soviet Union, and those fighting colonial domination. By 1952, the Pentagon was mired in a war to keep Korea under its capitalist dominion. Does this look like freedom? Life in the U.S. didn't look much like an ad for freedom either. Jim Crow, apartheid-like conditions predominated, not only in the South, but in many northern cities as well. Post-war Father Knows Best campaigns were designed to push Rosie the Riveter out of the factories and back into the kitchen. Senator Joseph McCarthy was empowered to hunt down communists and progressives and to crush or intimidate dissent or resistance. Gains in civil liberties, union organizing, and political expression were overturned. Jewish revolutionaries and progressives who had been in the forefront of movements for social and economic justice bore an onslaught of anti-Semitism and anti-communism unleashed in relative tandem. It was in this political context that a wave of anti-homosexual and anti-transsexual rhetoric and repression reached a fevered pitch. Part 27, 1950, the Lavender Scare. Life got a whole lot harder in the US during the late 1940s and early 1950s for people who were attracted to others of the same sex, who were considered gender different, or who lived in a sex other than the one assigned them at birth. The domestic witch hunt of the McCarthy era, whose main purpose was to crush any opposition to the Cold War, also led to the firing, red listing, and publicly outing of people who didn't fit the straitjacketed classification of straight, and anything considered queer was branded subversive. As early as 1947, some congressional Republicans veiled their partisan political attacks against the State Department with claims of concern about homosexuals working there. In 1948, a public attempt to link anti-capitalists and homosexuals was promulgated in blaring media coverage that suggested Whittaker Chambers had an amorous fondness for Alger Hiss. Chambers, a Time magazine editor and journalist and former Communist Party member, was accused of collecting intelligence information for the Soviet Union. Chambers flipped and offered, quote, evidence for the anti-communist campaign. He implicated Alger Hiss, who headed the Carnegie Endowment, in Soviet espionage. Chambers also allegedly told the FBI that while a member of the Communist Party, he had been sexually active with men. But the Lavender Scare, like the other hue of terror and repression, the Red Scare, began in earnest in 1950. Before it ended, the two had become inextricably linked as one vicious slur, Pinko F slur. While this kind of language is painful to reprint, it is important to get a feel for the tenor of that period. Panic on the Potomac. On February 9, 1950, notorious red baiter Senator Joseph McCarthy, Republican from Wisconsin, waved a piece of paper before the cameras that he claimed contained a list of 205, quote, card-carrying communists in the State Department. Alger Hiss had been convicted of perjury on January 21st, just weeks before this now infamous Wheeling, West Virginia speech. McCarthy railed that the Democratic Truman administration was harboring traitors who were plotting to give away top-secret information. John Purfoy, Undersecretary of State, denied the charge in February before a Senate Appropriations Committee hearing investigating quote-unquote subversives. But he did raise the specter of a sinister homosexual underground in Washington that was in cahoots with the quote communist conspiracy. Source here is Becoming Visible, a reader in gay and lesbian history. He said that 91, quote, sexual deviants were among those who had been dismissed from the State Department as, quote, security risks. This sounded a toxin, observes David K. Johnson in his book, The Lavender Scare, The Cold War Persecution of Gays and Lesbians in the Federal Government. Quote, members of Congress demanded to know who hired the 91, whether they found jobs in other government departments, and if there were any more. Seeming to confirm McCarthy's charges about subversives in the State Department, Purfoy's revelation prompted concern and outrage throughout the nation, heated debates on the floors of Congress, congressional committee investigations, countless newspaper articles, and numerous White House hearings. Quote, it eventually led to the ouster of thousands of government employees. It marked the beginnings of a Lavender Scare. While some politicians labeled the campaign the, quote, purge of the perverts, some journalists ridiculed it as the Panic on the Potomac. Comment here, if this sounds a little bit like what Trump and the Republican Party more broadly have been proposing and executing under the whole groomers panic and also the quote deep state thing, then yes, we agree. In fact, I think a lot of these things, as far as the whole Red Scare, it's coming back, although I think that there's a lot more open resistance to it now than there was in the 50s. And we just have to keep that up. Don't let them get away with it. You know, they're going to keep trying, but just make it futile. You know, we don't care. If you don't buy in, if you don't get riled up, which is the whole point of it, you know, it's to cause a panic, well, then it falls flat, and they look like the assholes that they are. Anyway, continuing. McCarthyism, not just McCarthy. While the domestic witch hunt of lesbian, gay men, and gender-variant people was an integral component of McCarthyism, Joe McCarthy himself was not the mover and shaker behind the anti-homosexual frenzy, and perhaps for good reason. True, the senator from Wisconsin did pepper his tirades with references to, quote, communists and queers. But as the political crusade took off, McCarthy was nowhere to be seen. Quote, though he was a member of the congressional committee that spent several months examining the homosexuals in government issue, McCarthy mysteriously recused himself from those hearings, Johnson notes. McCarthy, the middle-aged perennial bachelor, was vulnerable to questions about his own sexuality that were to circulate soon enough. Instead, senior colleagues took up the cudgel, including Senators Styles Bridges, Republican from New Hampshire, Kenneth Wherry, Republican from Nebraska, and Clyde Hoey, Democrat from North Carolina. In April 1950, Republican National Committee Chair Guy Gabrielson charged that a, quote, conspiracy was underway. Gabrielson's statement read in part, quote, "Perhaps as dangerous as the actual communists are the sexual perverts who have infiltrated our government in recent years," unquote. While Gabrielson claimed the media was not doing enough to alert the population to the, quote, homosexual menace, this was merely self-serving demagogy. The media helped to whip the frenzy to a fevered pitch. The New York Times took the lead, running at least 7 stories promoting this anti-homosexual campaign in May and June of 1950. Comment, the more things change, ... Continuing, in May 1950, WWII quoted, quote, reliable police sources that 3,750 homosexuals were ensconced in federal jobs. A month later, the Senate authorized an official investigation, the first of its kind in U.S. history. It was popularly dubbed the, quote, pervert inquiry. The politically motivated results of these hearings, issued in December, charged the Truman administration with indifference toward the danger of homosexuals in government. The official, quote, justification for this witch hunt against gay and lesbian employees was cited as, quote, lack of emotional stability and, quote, weakness of moral fiber that allegedly made them likely victims of Soviet propaganda and recruitment. I would like to think that the popular understanding of mental health topics has improved since that time, such that such attacks are not nearly as effective as they might have been in the past. But they still keep it up today, particularly against transgender people. The it's a mental illness and all that kind of stuff. Like I said, they're just going to keep at it. It's a really old playbook. We just have to not take any shit. What if they held a moral panic and no one came? Continuing, by November of that year, close to 600 federal civil workers had lost their jobs. In the State Department alone, security officials bragged that they were firing 1 homosexual per day, more than twice the rate of those charged with political disloyalty to capitalism. Where he concluded in December, quote, you can't hardly separate homosexuals from subversives. Mind you, I don't say that every homosexual is a subversive, real broad-minded sort here, and I don't say that every subversive is a homosexual. Wouldn't want to stereotype people now. But people of low morality are a menace in the government, whatever they are, and they're all tied up together, unquote. That's from the New York Post, December 1950. 1950s witch hunt. Even McCarthy was gay-baited. In the 1950s, more bombshells were to detonate in the overall offensive against the Lavender menace, which had become a foil for the right wing in the domestic Cold War. In 1951, Guy Burgess and Donald McLean, 2 gay double agents working in British intelligence, fled to the Soviet Union. This was grist for the mill, linking homosexuality with communist, quote, treason. In 1952, worldwide publicity accompanied the entrapment and arrest of British mathematician and computer innovator Alan Turing. He was one of 1,686 men rounded up and charged with, quote, gross indecency with males. Turing had risen to fame during World War II after he deciphered a Nazi secret code. Turing was sentenced to a year of hormonal treatments, which reportedly caused impotence and breast development, and became the target of British government scrutiny as a potential, quote, subversive. He killed himself 2 years later at the age of 41. And commenting, there was a 2014 movie starring Benedict Cumberbatch about Turing. The title is The Imitation Game. Continuing. In the U.S., transphobia also took center stage in 1952, when Christine Jorgensen's plane touched down carrying her home from Denmark, where she'd sought hormonal and surgical help with sex reassignment. 300 reporters surged forward, shouting questions as flashbulbs popped. She became the brunt of a dehumanizing and degrading campaign from the bully pulpits of radio, newspaper, and television. And that same year, even Cold Warrior Senator Joseph McCarthy was publicly baited as a homosexual. Hoisted by their own petard. After the 1952 election, in which the Republicans won back Senate control, McCarthy took over as chair of the investigation subcommittee of the Committee on Government Operations. He hired 25-year-old attorney Roy Cohn as his chief counsel. Cohn in turn recruited David Schein, later rumored to be his lover, to become chief consultant. And commenting, Roy Cohn would also become a mentor to future U.S. President Donald Trump. And I just have to say that any time I make reference to the fact that Donald Trump became president of this country, not once but twice now, I mean, it just makes you look at how capitalist politics are falling apart. Continuing, Cohn had close contacts within the FBI. That was important for McCarthy, who reportedly worked hand in glove with J. Edgar Hoover's bureau between 1950 and 1953. One of Hoover's agents, William Sullivan, later conceded, quote, we were the ones who made the McCarthy hearings possible. We fed McCarthy all the material he was using, unquote. This information sharing was covert and quite illegal. Although bound by law to share information only with the executive branch, the Bureau had also reportedly leaked background checks to Congress. Hoover was said to have recommended Roy Cohn for the post with McCarthy because he was impressed by the young attorney's railroading of Communist Party members Ethel Rosenberg and Julius Rosenberg to the electric chair on charges of passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. Hoover himself has been rumored to have had a long-term affair with an assistant, Clyde Tolson. Quote, as McCarthy's henchman and chief counsel, he, meaning Cohn, was responsible for grilling suspected communists on their own sexual tendencies and on whether other people had, quote, homosexual tendencies. Cohn and McCarthy subpoenaed gay men in the arts and threatened to out them if they did not produce a list of, quote, suspected communists, unquote. McCarthy had made a name for himself as point man for a far right-wing current that attacked the Truman administration for the, quote, loss of China from imperialist exploitation after the monumental communist-led revolution there. But when McCarthy leveled his guns at the Eisenhower administration for not being, quote, tough enough on communism, he got his comeuppance. That was when he found himself in the crosshairs of the anti-homosexual witch hunt. In 1952, journalist Hank Greenspun wrote a column about the ambitious senator, which could not have found its way into print without powerful support. It said that, quote, Joe McCarthy is a bachelor of 43 years. He seldom dates girls, and if he does, he laughingly describes it as window dressing. It is common talk among homosexuals in Milwaukee, who rendezvous in the White Horse Inn, that Senator Joe McCarthy has often engaged in homosexual activities, unquote. That was from the Las Vegas Sun, October 25, 1952. While McCarthy was said to have briefly threatened to sue Greenspun for libel, he later declined to do so, reportedly after lawyers told him it meant he'd have to testify about his sexuality. Less than a year later, McCarthy married his secretary, Jeannie Kerr. In March 1953, McCarthy tried to defeat Eisenhower's appointment of Charles Bolin as ambassador to Russia. Bolin was a shrewd imperialist diplomat who had participated in the 1945 Yalta Conference at which Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin had negotiated over the shape of post-war Europe. McCarthy tried to enlist Hoover's help, but although Hoover allegedly said that Bolin had, quote, associated with homosexuals, and that an FBI investigation had found him weak from, quote, the security and morals angle, unquote, Hoover said he couldn't provide evidence. Bolin was confirmed. McCarthy also tried to cast aspersions on the Secretary of the Army, Robert Stevens. But when the senator from Wisconsin attempted to probe the echelons of the Army brass for subversives at the height of the Korean War, he had crossed the line. His self-promoting witch hunt was now being extended to anyone who stood in his way, including seasoned members of the imperialist military political establishment itself. Eisenhower, a former Army general, and in many ways the architect of the modern military-industrial complex, allowed the hearings to be televised to publicly expose McCarthy's tyrannical bullying. This was a tactic to arouse public anger at his intimidation tactics, and it provided the basis for the Senate to censure McCarthy in December 1954 by a vote of 67 to 22. Whether McCarthy, Hoover, Cohn, and other Cold Warriors in their circles thought of themselves as homosexuals, and whether or not they had sex with other men is not really the issue. Seen from the standpoint of sexuality, it seems inexplicable, like when Ernst Röhm and other gay Nazis helped to violently smash the German homosexual emancipation movement. However, McCarthy, like Röhm, hated the grassroots working-class movement that challenged capitalist rule from below, and like so many other right-wingers, he was willing to use every prejudice and reactionary attitude in this struggle. McCarthy had made crystal clear on his very first day in the Senate which side of the class barricade he was on. He called together the media to publicize his, quote, solution to a coal strike then underway. He demanded that miners' union leader John L. Lewis and the striking workers be conscripted into the Army. If miners in uniform still refused to dig coal, McCarthy proposed they be court-martialed for insubordination and shot to death. Full fury of the state fist. The media fanfare over the federal anti-homosexual witch hunt died down after 1950. Historian David K. Johnson stresses, however, that the lessening of publicity was, quote, not a testament to the lack of anti-gay efforts, but to their routinization and institutionalization in the aftermath of the national security state, unquote. The Democratic Truman administration had caved into the right wing, ramping up firings of federal employees accused of being homosexuals, after the Senate issued the results of its, quote, investigation into gays and lesbians in government employ in December 1950. Firings in the State Department, for example, climbed from 54 in 1950 to 119 in 1951 to 134 in 1952. Within 3 months of being sworn in at his inauguration in 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower issued Executive Order 10450. This act empowered all federal agencies to investigate and fire workers on the grounds of, quote, sexual perversion. Johnson adds, government shared police and military records with private employers, resulting in the dismissal of hundreds, unquote. He emphasizes that this overall repressive campaign must be understood as much broader than the work of Joseph McCarthy alone. Quote, to attribute the purges to McCarthy serves to marginalize them historically. It suggests that they were the product of a uniquely unscrupulous demagogue who did not enjoy widespread support and were not part of mainstream conservatism or the Republican Party. And he concludes, quote, it ignores how the purges predated McCarthy, became institutionalized within the federal loyalty security system, and continued to be standard government policy until the 1970s, unquote. In his book, The Riots That Sparked the Gay Revolution, David Carter offers a detailed and important overview of the iron-fisted state repression during the Cold War. Quote, the Civil Service Commission and the FBI complied by initiating an intense campaign to ferret out homosexuals by, for instance, correlating morals arrests across the United States with lists of government employees and checking fingerprints of job applicants against the FBI's fingerprint files, unquote. He recalls how states wrote new, more repressive laws or beefed up sentencing. Quote, for example, California Governor Earl Warren thought the sex offender problem so serious that in 1949 he convened a special session of the state legislature to deal with the issue. That session passed laws that increased the penalties for sodomy and invented a new crime, loitering in a public toilet, unquote. The names of everyone convicted of lingering in a toilet were added to a state register. Quote, 29 states enacted new sexual psychopath laws and/or revised existing ones, and homosexuals were commonly the law's primary targets. In almost all states, professional licenses could be revoked or denied on the basis of homosexuality so that professionals could lose their livelihoods, unquote. And conviction brought with it terrible suffering. Carter emphasizes that by 1961, quote, an adult convicted of a crime of having sex with another consenting adult in the privacy of his or her home could get anywhere from a light fine to 5, 10, or 20 years, even life in prison. In 1971, 20 states had sex psychopath laws that permitted the detaining of homosexuals for that reason alone. In Pennsylvania and California, sex offenders could be locked in a mental institution for life, and in 7 states they could be castrated, unquote. Carter adds, quote, at California's Atascadero State Hospital, known soon after its opening as Dachau for Queers, men convicted of consensual sodomy were, as authorized by a 1941 law, given electrical and pharmacological shock therapy, castrated, and lobotomized, unquote. The state machinery, police, courts, prisons, military, had already been used as a weapon to besiege gay, lesbian, trans, and bisexual people in the U.S. in the 1920s and 1930s. What changed in the ensuing 2 decades to unleash the state in such a ferocious, cruel, and widespread effort to control sexuality? And was there resistance? Oh yes. Part 29. Early Resistance to State Repression. In the inhospitable social climate of the Cold War, struggles were taking root in the U.S. that would later flower in the gay and trans liberation movement of the late 1960s. How was it possible, some may wonder today, for gays to have resisted and organized in the 1940s and 1950s, when state repression and a reactionary ideological offensive were at their height? In the war between exploiter and exploited, oppressor and oppressed, the relationship of forces may change many times, but those under siege never cease to find ways to struggle for their freedom. Much of the history of the struggle for homosexual and gender and women's rights in the decades of greatest political repression has been buried under the reactionary weight of the Cold War propaganda machine. Understanding how the early stirrings of the homophile movement of the 1940s and 1950s began serves to arm today's movement, which has much greater possibilities for resistance against political reaction. Also, the 1969 Stonewall Rebellion and the mass political wave of struggle it unleashed can seem almost accidental or episodic without a general overview of the acts of resistance and attempts to organize that preceded the 4-night-long uprising. The choice of language to describe these earlier decades is difficult. Similar words may be used to describe sex, love, and affection with regard to different historical periods, economic classes, nationalities, ethnicities, and regions. However, the ways people saw themselves and each other, and the ways medical authorities, police, courts, and military brass categorized and criminalized people and their behaviors have undergone many changes. The world of same-sex love among many blue-collar and oppressed people in the first half of the century in the US was intertwined with gender and sex variance, or what today might be referred to as transgender and transsexual. Although commenting, this work was written about 20 years ago, and even between then and now, transsexual has fallen out of use. When it's used, it's really more of a pejorative. Anyway, continuing. It's hard to separate bisexuality from the exclusive expression of same-sex love in early periods. Here, LGBT will be used, not to stamp the past with a modern acronym that has come to symbolize a united front coalition of sexuality, gender, and sex minorities, but to show the inability to parse the population into distinct categories. Centralizing force of capitalism. The rise of the 1940s and 1950s homophile movement itself is hard to fathom without taking into account the awakening of LGBT people in the 1920s and 1930s. Material developments in life under capitalism made this not only possible in those early decades of the 20th century, but necessary. By the end of the 19th century, northern industrial capital and banking had consolidated its victory over the southern slave-owning landed aristocracy. The overturning of black Reconstruction through lynch, quote, law and Jim Crow fascist conditions had brought a violent end to an unfinished revolution. This created huge shifts in the population from agriculture to urban areas in search of jobs. In these vast, anonymous cities and port towns, with same-sex boarding houses and parks and piers, nascent LGBT subcultures took shape. U.S. capitalism, unable to satiate its hunger for profits through domestic expansion alone, emerged as an imperialist power, exporting war for empire and profits to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines in 1898. A decade and a half later, the world's imperialist powers dragged the workers into a gory struggle over redividing the world's colonies in the First World War. The military deployment and wartime industry also pulled massive numbers of women and men from rural areas, small towns, and cities into same-sex living conditions and new social conditions that broke down the old order. It was workers' revolution that scared the imperialists into finally ending the war. The Cold War really began in the US after the workers and peasants of Russia rose up in the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution and established the first lasting workers' state. The revolution reverberated around the globe, lifting the heads of laboring and oppressed peoples in every part of the world. The communist government in Russia immediately struck down the anti-homosexual laws. In the US, however, the capitalist government made LGBT people one of the early targets of repression, along with communists, anarchists, trade unionists, and immigrants. Military witch hunt. In the spring of 1919, the brass at the Newport Naval Training Center covertly sent a group of young enlisted men into the base and the nearby community to lure, quote, sexual perverts and bring back evidence about, quote, immoral conditions. After entrapment had provided the necessary, quote, evidence, naval and municipal officials rounded up more than 20 sailors and 16 civilians. They faced naval and civilian trials. It was one thing when the dragnet ensnared enlisted sailors, mostly from the working class. But when a prominent minister from the Episcopal Church of Newport got caught in the nets, and civilian and later military officials forced him to stand trial, all hell broke loose. Quote, protests by the Newport Ministerial Union and the Episcopal Bishop of Rhode Island and a vigorous editorial campaign by the Providence Journal forced the Navy to conduct a second inquiry in 1920 into the methods used in the first investigation. Historian George Chauncey Jr. wrote, quote, when the inquiry criticized the methods but essentially exonerated the senior naval officials who had instituted them, the ministers asked the Republican-controlled Senate Naval Affairs Committee to conduct its own investigation, unquote. The Republicans agreed, eager to attack the Democratic administration. The Senate committee issued its report in 1921. It exonerated the minister. Although the report, Chauncey noted, quote, expressed deep anti-homosexual loathing, it condemned the conduct of the highest naval officials involved, including Franklin D. Roosevelt, President Wilson's Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and the 1920 Democratic vice presidential candidate. That's quoting from Homosexual Identities and the Construction of Sexual Boundaries in the World War I era. Smoke, lilies, and jade. The mass migrations to large cities, port towns, and military bases in the 1920s and 1930s had created the basis for larger and more concentrated subcultures. Chauncey provides evidence that LGBT life flourished more in the first third of the 20th century, particularly in the 1920s and 1930s, than it did after World War II. He described same-sex love and gender variance in New York, one of the capitals of LGBT life, as, quote, a working-class world. centered in African American and Irish and Italian immigrant neighborhoods and along the city's busy waterfront and drawing on the social forms of working-class culture," unquote. The most visible, organized, and eloquent LGBT expression in the pre-World War II era came from the Black movement in the United States. As the Great Migration from the South to the North burgeoned into Black urban capitals, LGBT expression became a part of their histories. Thousands attended LGBT balls in Harlem, Chicago, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., which were widely reported on in Black community newspapers. In New York, the balls were held at the Rockland Palace, the Astor Hotel, and Madison Square Garden. The most famous was the annual Hamilton Lodge Ball in Harlem, which dated back to 1879. The majority of those who attended were working class. About 800 took part in 1925, 1,500 in 1937. Attendance peaked at 8,000 in 1937 before police raids shut it down. Comment, I'm not sure if that's a typo, as 1937 was just cited twice, but continuing. Harlem was the heart of one of the great cultural and political high watermarks of U.S. history, the Harlem Renaissance, which ran from the end of World War I in 1918 until the capitalist depression. This flowering of literature, art, music, and political organizing, all of which was influenced by aspirations for national liberation and hope for an end to dreams deferred, sparked by the socialist revolution in Russia, also gave voice to LGBT concerns. Richard Bruce Nugent, a self-identified gay man, published the classic Smoke, Lilies, and Jade in 1926. It was the first known work by a Black author clearly about same-sex love. He said about LGBT life in Harlem during that period, quote, "Nobody was in the closet. There wasn't any closets."